I've been asked to tell this story 3 times now. Once to the Mira Security Board, once to the Interstellar Research Council, and now to whoever you are. Sitting across from me in a room that smells like recycled air and institutional coffee, with a recorder on the table and a notepad you keep not writing in. You want to understand what happened out there. You want a clean account. I'll give you the account. I won't promise it's clean. My name is Elena Vasquez, Chief Engineer, Mira Research Vessel Ardent. Mission designation PR-7 out of Polis Outpost. I held that post for 11 years. I don't hold it anymore, because the Ardent no longer exists and most of the people I worked with are dead. Some of them by my hand, and some of them by what we brought back from Polis, and some of them because we couldn't tell the difference fast enough. You'll want context before the events. Let me give you the ship first, because the ship matters. A Skeld-class deep hauler is not a military vessel. It wasn't designed for combat or for crisis, or for anything more dramatic than the sustained movement of personnel and material across long distances in a vacuum. The Ardent was the oldest active Skeld class in the Mira fleet. 42 years of service by the time of the PR-7 mission, patched and repatched every system carrying the ghost of the system it had replaced. The hull plating on the port side had been replaced 3 times in different sections. And you could see it in the coloration, if you knew what to look for. Like growth rings on a tree. The reactor was original equipment, which sounds alarming until you understand that original Skeld reactor engineering was overbuilt to a degree that bordered on paranoid. Whoever designed them believed in margins, wide ones, and they had proven right every time the Ardent had needed to push past rated capacity and hadn't shaken apart. The cafeteria was the center of the ship's life. Long composite table, 12 chairs. A kitchen galley at one end that Breckenridge had claimed as personal territory from his first week aboard, and defended with the absolute authority of a man who cooked better than anyone else, and knew it. The walls were covered in the accumulated evidence of years of habitation. A printed photograph of the Polis surface at dawn that Okafor had taped up 2 missions ago, a hand-drawn schematic of the reactor's secondary cooling loop that I'd made, and never bothered to remove. A small laminated card with the emergency procedures that nobody had read since their certification, and everybody knew by memory anyway. Tamboli had scratched a small tally of successful landings into the wall above her usual seat. 3 marks the last time I counted. The crew ran 11 on a standard PR-7 rotation, myself, Dr. Or in biology, Commander Reyes in command, pilots Tamboli and Quan Medic Hargreaves, communications officer Delacroix, security officer Fennick, lab techs Morrow and Sanjay, and Breckenridge in the galley. 11 people is a small world. 2 years on Polis and 3 transit legs between the outpost and Mira headquarters. You know every person aboard the way you know a piece of machinery you've maintained with your own hands. Not from a manual, but from 10,000 small contacts. You know their sounds in the corridor at 0400 when the ship is quiet. You know the rhythm of their footsteps, the particular way they hold a mug, the specific register of their breathing when they're tired versus when they're worried. You know who sleeps through anything and who lies awake until a sound resolves itself into something familiar. You know who is the first out of their bunk when an alarm fires, and who is the last. And whether the last is because they're slow, or because they've already decided what the alarm means, and taken their time walking toward it. That intimacy is what the thing used against us. I'll start at the beginning of the end, which was a Tuesday by the ship's calendar. 3 days out of Polis and 14s from Mira headquarters, in the specimen bay. Dr. Okafor ran the biology lab. Man, methodical. The kind of scientist who triple-checked his seals and documented every procedure in a handwriting so precise it looked typeset. He'd been collecting samples from the subsurface excavations on Polis for the better part of 6 months. Rock cores, atmospheric pockets, trace organic material scraped from the warm water vents that honeycombed the planet's lower crust. Most of it was unremarkable by the standards of the mission brief. Mineralogical records, some evidence of ancient microbial activity, the kind of data that fills journal papers nobody reads, but which forms the slow sedimentary record that science actually runs on. Okafor was good at the unremarkable work. He had patience for it in a way that some scientists don't. He understood that 9/10 of fieldwork is documentation, and he documented everything. About 10 days before departure, the drilling team had broken into a new chamber, deeper than anything previously mapped. Below the third geothermal layer, in a section of the subsurface that the survey hadn't flagged as especially interesting, the team lead, a geologist named Prescott, who had gone home on the previous transit rotation, had flagged it in his outgoing report as anomalous. The chamber was sealed, not by geological pressure, but by what appeared to be a crystalline biological matrix. And the interior temperature was significantly warmer than the surrounding rock. And there had been movement recorded by the drill sensors before they pulled back. Prescott had recommended sealing and escalating to Mira leadership before any collection. Okafor had gone down himself and collected a sample. He didn't log the collection at the time. We found the missing log entry later, after, when we were looking for everything we'd missed. He'd brought it aboard in a pressurized cylinder about the size of a thermos. Triple-locked, biohazard-wrapped, the kind of containment protocol that Okafor knew by rote and applied correctly. He'd tagged it in the specimen manifest as an organic trace sample from geothermal vent 7, which was accurate only in the most technical geographic sense. He had not noted that it was from the sealed chamber. He had not noted that the drill sensors had recorded movement. I asked him about it the week before we lifted off, in the specimen bay, because I was doing my final cargo accounting, and the biohazard protocol on that particular container was a level higher than the rest of the samples. He was logging it, making entries on his tablet, and he answered me without fully looking up. He said the lab at Mira headquarters needed to see it in person. He said documentation wasn't adequate. He said some things needed to be seen, to be understood. I asked him what was in it. He said, "I'm not sure yet. I think it's dormant." I should have pressed him. I know that. Okafor was the senior science officer, and I was engineering, and the disciplines had their lanes. And he had triple-locked the container and followed containment protocol. And I had 11 years of experience telling me that Okafor was meticulous and competent, and would not do anything genuinely reckless with biological material. I noted the container in the manifest, sealed the bay, and went back to the pre-flight checks that were my actual job. We lifted off on a Wednesday morning with all 11 crew aboard. Polis fell away beneath us, gray-white and cold, its surface cracked and steaming where the geothermal vents broke through to the atmosphere. The sky above the planet was that particular shade of deep purple, black, that I have tried to describe to people who haven't seen it and never quite managed. Darker than night on Earth, darker than anything called a sky should be, with a quality of weight to it that you feel in the chest. I watched it from the observation window for a long time. I don't know why. Something in me was reluctant to leave. And I don't mean reluctant the way you are reluctant to end a vacation. I mean, reluctant the way you are reluctant to turn your back on something. We were 3 days out when Okafor stopped showing up to meals. Not unusual in itself. Scientists get absorbed. And Okafor had formed for going deep into work and surfacing hours late with apologies and a plate of cold food he'd reheated twice. Hargreaves mentioned it to me on day 2 of his absence, because she'd seen him in the corridor at 0300, standing outside the specimen bay door in his civilian clothes, not responding when she called to him. She'd initially thought he was sleepwalking. She'd put a hand on his shoulder and spoken his name twice, and he'd turned and looked at her, and then walked back toward his bunk without saying anything. And she'd filed it as a minor medical note and come to me with it in the morning, because she wasn't sure it rose to the level of requiring action. I thought about it. I decided it was fatigue. The outpost work had been grinding in the last 2 months. Okafor had been spending long days underground in the new excavations, and the transit adjustments hit people differently. I told Hargreaves to keep an eye on it, and went back to the secondary cooling loop, which was showing a slight pressure variance I wanted to track before it became a real problem. The next morning, Okafor was at breakfast. He ate normally. He answered questions normally. He made a small joke about the coffee, the same joke he always made, about the filtration system and the distinct flavor profile of recycled water, which had gotten laughs for the first year, and now got polite smiles. He ate his eggs. He asked Tamboli about the fuel consumption numbers. He was present and engaged and exactly himself. The only thing wrong was his eyes. And I spent most of that meal trying to identify what was wrong with them, turning it over the way you turn over a system fault you can hear but can't locate. And eventually I decided they were fine. I was tired. I was looking for something, because Hargreaves had put the thought in my head. Before had a habit of looking slightly past whoever he was talking to. Not rudely, not obviously, just the slightly unfocused middle-distance gaze of a man whose mind was usually running 2 or 3 tracks at once. These eyes were different. They were fully on you, present and attending in a way his usually weren't. I thought it meant he was feeling better. I thought it meant he was rested and engaged with the day. I was wrong about what it meant. Found what was left of the real Okafor in the storage compartment behind the reactor housing at 1400 hours on day 4. I was running the Security-Kloop's check when the sound started, a high sound, cutting through the ventilation noise, climbing registers that made the hairs on my forearms stand up before my brain had fully processed what it was hearing. I locked the coolant panel and moved toward the sound. Morrow was in the compartment doorway when I found her. She was pressed into the frame with both hands over her mouth, and she was still making the sound, though quieter now. And she didn't look at me when I came up behind her. She was looking at what was in the compartment. I won't describe it. I'll tell you the body had been there for at least 2 days by Hargreaves's later estimate. And I'll tell you the nature of it left no ambiguity about cause of death. And I'll tell you that what I felt looking at it was something I don't have a clinical word for. A cold, hollowing sensation. Like something structural had given way inside my chest. Something I'd been standing on without knowing it. Sealed the compartment. I called the crew to the cafeteria. That was the first meeting. 11 chairs around the long table. 11 faces. 10 of them showing the particular human expression of people who have just been told something that reorganizes the world around them, struggling to incorporate information that doesn't fit any previous frame. The thing that had been Okafor showed nothing, or rather it showed exactly what should have been there, calibrated precisely, which was a controlled grief, the expression of a scientist who had lost a colleague and was holding it together with professional discipline. I have since spent a great deal of time thinking about that calibration. It was correct. It was what Okafor would have shown. It was correct in a way that required knowing what Okafor's grief looked like, which meant it had been watching him long enough before he died to learn. Commander Reyes ran the meeting. She was sharp, military-trained before Mira, the kind of person who doesn't flinch or who knows how to look like she doesn't. She laid it out in plain language. One of us was not human. The specimen container in the bay was empty. The seal broken from the inside, in a way that no human hand could have managed from the exterior. Whatever Okafor had brought aboard from the deep chambers of Polis had been dormant in the container. And it was dormant no longer. And it had taken Okafor first. It had taken his shape. It was at this table. You could feel the air in the room change. Temperature. The environmental systems didn't register anything. But something changed. Some quality of the attention in the room. And every person at that table felt it, even if none of them could have named it precisely. I watched the thing that had been Okafor sit across the table and listened to Commander Reyes describe it. It listened the way Okafor listened. Hands folded on the table, weight slightly forward, slight frown of concentration. It made appropriate small responses. It looked at Reyes when she was speaking, and at the rest of us when she paused. The specimen container, it said, should never have been loaded without a full biological clearance sign-off. Breach protocol for that class of container was clear. It was angry about this, it said, in a controlled way, the way Okafor got angry. Fennec said, that's convenient, isn't it? Biologists telling us what the biological protocols should have been. The thing looked at him with Okafor's eyes. It said, convenient how? You know the protocols better than anyone else at this table, Fennec said. If I wanted to make it look like I couldn't have known this would happen, I'd lead with the protocols too. There was a silence. Sanjay said, you could say that about anyone making any point at all. Yes, Fennec said. Could. And then everyone was talking at once, and I learned in the next 20 minutes something about accusation and group dynamics that I'd never had occasion to learn before, which is that the first accusation in a room is like a first crack in a hull. It doesn't relieve the pressure, it creates a path for more. Within an hour, we had generated suspicion about 4 different people, including Fennec himself for having been the first to accuse, and each new suspicion generated a counter-argument, and each counter-argument generated 3 more. And Reyes finally put her hand flat on the table and said, with a coldness that stopped the room, "We are not going to solve this by talking faster." She was right. We didn't vote that day. The tally was 4 in favor of ejecting the thing that had been Okafor, 7 against. The 7 including myself. And I have thought about whether that was the right call and whether I was simply not ready to watch what looked like Okafor's face go out into the vacuum. I don't have a clean answer for you. I can tell you the logic. Insufficient evidence, no physical confirmation, the possibility of a catastrophic error against someone who was still themselves. I can tell you that logic was sound as far as it went. Tell you, we lasted 19 more hours before the second body. Sanjay was found in the laboratory between 2 specimen tables. He was 26 years old. First deep space posting, prone to nervous laughter when he was anxious, which was often, but genuinely talented with chemical analysis, the kind of quiet technical competence that does most of the actual work on a research mission, while the senior scientists get the citations. He'd been on watch with Morrow, as his partner, per the paired observation protocol Reyes had established. Morrow was found unconscious in the corridor outside the lab, her head having struck the wall panel at sufficient velocity to raise a significant contusion. She had no memory of the corridor. Her last clear memory was standing at the central lab bench, reviewing the previous day's readings, with Sanjay 2 meters to her right. The access log showed the lab door had opened and closed 4 times in 40 minutes. The second meeting was different from the first. We were down to 10. The empty chair at the table, Sanjay's chair, had a quality that I noticed and couldn't stop noticing: the specific absence of a specific person in a specific place, the way a missing tooth feels with the tongue, 9 faces showing grief or fear, or the particular lockdown blankness of people managing both. 1 face showing the correct amount of grief and the correct amount of fear. I was watching more carefully now. I had spent the intervening 19 hours watching, and what I had concluded was that watching didn't work. The mimicry was not a loose fit, it was exact. Whatever biology underlay it, whatever process translated a dead man's surface into a living performance, it was not approximate. The hands moved right. The posture was right. The small habitual things, the way the thing that wore Okafor's face tapped 1 finger twice on any hard surface before speaking, a tell that the real Okafor had had for as long as I'd known him, were right. If there was a seam, I couldn't find it by looking. What was visible, if you knew to look for it, was the meetings. The thing could mimic Okafor's habits, and Okafor's face, and Okafor's voice. What it could not fully mimic was Okafor's relationship with accusation. Okafor, the real man, had a defensive response to being doubted that came from genuine confidence, a slight stiffening, a tendency to repeat his evidence in more specific terms, a kind of professional dignity that got its back up. The thing's response to doubt was different. It was smoother. It acknowledged the logic of suspicion in a way that the real Okafor, who took professional slights personally, would not have done quite so graciously. That was thin evidence. That was a feeling I had. And the thing we had learned by the second meeting was that feelings were not votes. This time the vote was not about the thing that wore Okafor's face. It was about Morrow. She'd been alone with Sanjay. She'd been found physically unharmed when the thing typically left nothing behind. It was possible. Reyes walked through it, methodically, without apparent feeling, that an unharmed survivor served a purpose for the imposter. A confused witness, a source of apparent legitimacy, someone who could be pointed to. I couldn't have done it. Morrow was with me. Morrow sat at the table and listened to the logic being applied to her. She was not crying. She was very still. She had gone to the academy with Sanjay, and he had been the one who'd talked her out of withdrawing during her second year, when the field examination had gone badly, and she had told that story once, years ago, on the Polis surface, during a slow afternoon when the geology team was running late, and we had nothing to do but wait. She said, "I understand why you're asking. Ask me anything you need to ask, we asked. She answered everything correctly. Old memories, technical knowledge, personal history, the specific details of the polis, work that only someone who'd done it would know. The thing we'd been watching for 11 days also answered everything correctly. There was no test that worked. Hargreaves had run every biological scan she could run with the medbay equipment and found nothing. The thing registered as human on every diagnostic she had, which was all of them, because the medbay had been stocked for human crew on a research mission, not for identifying parasitic shapeshifters from an unknown taxonomy. The vote was 5-5. Reyes broke it. She said, "I'm sorry, Dr. Morrow. The evidence supports the risk." Morrow stood up from the table. She walked to the airlock with Reyes and Quan, and at the outer door she stopped and turned around and looked at each of us once. Not in accusation, not in appeal. Psst. The look of a person taking an inventory, making sure they have a clear picture of what they're leaving. She said, "If I'm wrong, I'm sorry." And then she stepped through and the door sealed behind her. I don't know if she was the thing. I will never know. That uncertainty is not going to resolve itself in this room or any other room. And I'd appreciate it if you'd stop looking like you're about to tell me there's a way to find out. We had 9 people now, 8 of them human, 1 of them not, and none of us certain which was which. The kills continued. Each one was different, and each one was the same, which is one of the things I've found hardest to explain in the month since. You'd think the pattern would make them easier. It didn't. Breckenridge was found in the galley, which was wrong in a way that was almost worse than wrong. The galley was his. Every research mission generates its informal territories. The places where particular people are always found. The corners that become associated with a person so thoroughly that you think of the person when you pass through even when they're not there. Breckenridge had colonized the galley, with 11 years of accumulated presence. The photographs above the stove, the specific way the utensils were arranged, the smell of whatever he was making, that was always slightly different from standard ship nutrition and always better. Finding what the thing had done in there was not just finding a body, it was finding the end of a place. The third meeting voted out Quan's co-pilot, a man named Hartley, who had joined the mission as a late replacement, and whom most of us knew less well than the others. The vote was 6-3. Hartley was not the thing. I don't believe he was, and Quan doesn't believe he was, and we've talked about it since enough that I've stopped trying to arrive at certainty. But the logic in the meeting was not unsound, only incomplete, and the vote had a momentum to it that I noticed and couldn't stop. When you've sat through 2 meetings and the first 2 votes haven't solved the problem, you start to hear the evidence differently. You start to want to solve it, and wanting to solve it is a bias the thing could use. Tamboli was next. She died in the cockpit during what should have been a guarded watch period. The paired observation protocol failing, not because we had abandoned it, but because the protocol's design assumption was that the thing would come from outside the pair. If one member of a pair was the thing, the protocol was worthless. It was worse than worthless, because it created a false sense of security that the partner would relax into. Tamboli had been paired with the thing that wore Okafor's face, because Okafor's specialization was biology, and his workstation was on the same deck as the cockpit, and the pairing had been Reyes's call based on proximity. I don't fault the call, I fault nothing. I am telling you what happened. I found out about Tamboli from Quan, who found out from the biosensor alert. She came to me in the reactor room, 3 decks down, and she said Tamboli's name once and stopped, and I understood from the stop that the number had changed. Quan had flown with Tamboli for 4 years. They had been in the rover on Polis during the storm with the card game that Quan still doesn't fully understand the rules of. She did not cry in the reactor room, but there was a quality to her stillness that I have not forgotten. 4th meeting, 7 chairs. The accusation in that room landed on a lab technician named Voss, who had made the mistake of being near the cockpit access corridor in the window before Tamboli died, without a clear account of why. Voss's explanation was true and insufficient, which is a combination that looks worse than a lie under the logic the meetings had developed, because a lie at least suggests the person knew they needed one. We voted him out 5-2. The kills did not stop. Delacroix, communications, went missing for 18 hours before we found her in the lower access corridor. The 18 hours of not knowing where she was had cost us something that I noticed in the fifth meeting with particular clarity. A rawness in the room, a thinning of the collective composure that Reyes had been working to maintain. 18 hours of running the ship and checking the sensor logs, and asking each other whether Delacroix had been seen, in voices that were carefully not asking the other question, had stripped something away. The meetings had been frightened from the beginning. But they had also been purposeful. They were the mechanism, the thing that kept us working the problem. After Delacroix, the fear was outrunning the purpose, and I could see it in the way people sat, in the length of the silences before they answered direct questions. Ress noticed. After the fifth meeting, she caught me in the corridor outside the cafeteria, and she said quietly, "They're going to start voting faster and thinking slower." I said, "I know." She said, "Which serves the thing?" I said, "Yes." She said, "What do we do?" I thought about it. I said, "We slow the meetings down, force more specificity, make everyone account for more time and more detail. Not because the detail will tell us anything certain, but because the process of producing it slows people down, and slowing people down is the one thing we can control." She said, "That also gives the thing more time to kill." I said, "Yes. Everything skillful gives it more time. The only thing that doesn't give it more time is acting on bad information, and that's Hartley and Voss." We looked at each other. She said, "Then we slow down and we pay that cost." Each death called a meeting. Each meeting sat fewer chairs. I want to try to explain what the meetings became, because I think it matters for understanding what came after. First meeting had been frightened and fractious and loud. The second had been tighter, grimmer, more focused. By the fourth and fifth, something had changed that I can only describe as professionalization. We had become practiced at a specific and terrible ritual, sitting across from each other, accounting for movements in the hours since the last meeting, looking for inconsistencies, building or undermining a case from evidence that was always incomplete and sometimes fabricated by the very entity we were trying to identify. Ran each one with the same flat efficiency. She didn't allow emotion to slow the process. She cut off tangents. She demanded specifics. Where were you? When? Who was with you? What did you observe? What did you hear? She was good at it. That is not a comfortable thing to admire, but it was true. She kept us thinking when thinking was the only weapon we had. Each meeting, the thing that wore Okafor contributed. It voted. It made arguments. Some of its arguments led us right. Some of them, I now believe, led us wrong in ways that served it. Not obviously, not crudely, but with a precision that suggested it was capable of modeling our decision process and introducing just enough correct reasoning to earn trust, and just enough misdirection to extend its survival. 7 days out of Mira headquarters. 6 people at the cafeteria table, Reyes, Hargreaves, Quan, Fennec, myself, and the thing. We did not know which of the 6 it was. Each had an alibi for some kills and not others. Each had moments that could be read as suspicious, and moments that could be read as innocent. The information was as thin as it had ever been, and the stakes were as high. Reyes called me to her quarters on the 7th day, late in the ship's evening. She closed the hatch and stood with her back to it in a way that made the small space feel smaller, and she said, "Tell me what you know." I said, "Nothing that would survive a vote." She said, "Tell me what you feel." That stopped me. I'd served under Reyes for 6 years and she had never, not once, asked me what I felt. She asked for reports. She asked for specifications. She dealt documentable fact and considered that a professional virtue. I looked at her for a long time. I tried to find what was wrong with her eyes. I couldn't find anything. I said, "Fennec." She didn't react visibly. She said, "Why?" I said, "Because he's the voice of patience." Every meeting where we voted to wait and waiting was wrong. Every time one of us died because we didn't act when we should have. Fennec was the one making the case for caution. Not loudest, not the most visible. The one making the measured argument that sounded like the most responsible position and kept us from voting. She was quiet, I said. It's intelligent. It's been watching us since before we left Polis, and it understands that the most dangerous thing it can do is draw attention. So it doesn't draw attention. It plays the person who's trying to keep the group rational. Every time rationality serves its interests, it makes the rational argument. Reyes said, that's also what an innocent person who is genuinely concerned about false ejections would do. I said, I know. She said, if you're right. I said, I know. We stood in her quarters for a while. The ship hummed around us, I said. The thing is patient and we're running out of time. 5 days to Mira headquarters. If we don't act before we dock, we carry it aboard and it goes into a facility with 300 personnel and we never find it again, she said. And if we're wrong, I said, then we've killed Fennec and the thing is still here and we have four crew left and 5 days to figure out which of the 4 it is. She said, that's not better. I said, no, it's better than docking with it still on board. She was quiet again. Then she said, Hargreaves is with Quan in the med bay. I want to call the meeting before anything separates them. We walked to the cafeteria together. The Ardent was quiet at that hour, the kind of deep ship quiet that only exists when the crew is at minimum, and most of them are trying not to make noise. My footsteps on the composite floor and hers, and the background voice of the reactor and the ventilation, and nothing else. Chairs, 6 faces. The same long table that had held 11, that had held 10, 9, 8, 7, and was now down to 6 and felt vast. Reyes presented the case, without attribution. She laid out the pattern. The instances where weighting had been wrong. The correlation with Fennec's arguments. The specific way his contributions to the meetings had served to extend the thing's window of operation. She was careful. She was precise. She was not making it personal. Fennec listened with the composure of a man who had heard himself accused of something before and knew how to hold still inside it. When Reyes finished, he said, it's a reasonable analysis. I can't disprove it. Exactly that. Not defensive. Testing. Acknowledging the logic, which was, as I have replayed it many times since, precisely what a man of genuine integrity would say when he'd been correctly followed to a conclusion he couldn't refute. And precisely what a thing that had spent 7 days studying men of integrity would say when it needed to appear to be one. The vote was 4-2. Fennec and one other opposing. Fennec walked to the airlock without being asked twice. At the outer door he stopped, and he turned back, and he looked at each of us the way Morrow had looked. That inventory look. That taking stock of what you're leaving look. He didn't say anything. Whatever was in his face, or whatever was behind his face, was not something I could read. He stepped through. 3 hours later, Hargreaves was dead. I was in the reactor room running the secondary cooling loop check. The same check I had been running every 18 hours, because the secondary cooling loop was old, and it required physical attention, or it would drift. And I was the engineer. And the ship still had to run regardless of what else was happening. Quan was with me. We had been standing 4 feet apart in near silence for close to an hour, maintaining the observation pairing, each of us aware of the other, in the new heightened way that awareness had taken on, not hostile, not suspicious exactly, more like the awareness you have of someone standing behind you in a narrow place, a background consciousness of proximity. The alert came through on my suit communicator. A BIOS sensor ping from the med bay, the kind that fires when a crew member's vital signs drop below a threshold. We looked at each other across 4 feet of reactor room, and in Quan's face I saw the same arithmetic I was doing, which was that 5 minus 1 was 4, and 4 minus 2 was 2, and we were 2, and one of the remaining 2 was not what they appeared to be. We ran. Hargreaves was in the med bay. I won't describe it. Tell you that she'd been a good medic, thorough and calm, and the kind of person who came and found you when she thought you weren't eating enough, which she'd done to me twice in the first month of the mission, and I'd resented and later been grateful for. I'll tell you that losing her was different from the others, not in kind but in accumulation. There is a specific weight that builds with each one, and by the time you get to the 8th, it is not heavier than the 7th, so much as it has become the shape of everything. I turned from the med bay, and Quan was in the doorway, with her back against the frame. Face had gone the color of old concrete. I said, it's you or it's me. She said, I know. I said, tell me something only Quan would know. She laughed. It was the worst sound I've heard that wasn't screaming, not hysterical, not broken, just the laugh of someone who fully understands how absurd a request is, and how lethal the absurdity behind it. She said, there is no such thing, you know that. You've known it since Okafor. She was right. There was no such thing. The thing that wore Okafor's face had known everything Okafor knew. Whatever process it used, it was not approximate. Asking Kwon for secret knowledge was asking for the test that we had already run 11 times, and that had never worked. Said, then here's what we do. Neither of us moves toward the other. We stay in this room, in these positions. We talk. She said, about what? I said, about anything, about Kwon, about things Kwon said and did and was. And I'll talk about Vasquez. And while we're talking, we're going to be listening. She said, for what? I said, not for information. Information doesn't work. We're going to be listening for something else. She looked at me across the medbay. The emergency lights were dim. Hargreaves hadn't finished the overnight cycle, or something had interrupted it. And the room had a quality of insufficient illumination that made everything look slightly wrong, the way things look when you wake up in the dark and need a moment to locate yourself. She said, that's not a system. That's not a methodology. I said, no. She said, you're an engineer. You should be trying to give me a methodology. I said, I'm an engineer who's been watching the same organism defeat every methodology we have for 8 days. I'm done with methodologies. She was quiet. Then she said, what are we listening for? I said, whether we sound like ourselves. I know what that sounds like in this room. I know how it reads in a report. Engineer, 11 years on a research vessel, proposing to stake 2 lives and a potentially contaminated docking on whether someone sounds like themselves. No quantifiable trick, no reproducible test, no standard she could defend before a review board. I am not defending it. I am telling you what we did. We talked for 2 hours. About the mission, about Polis, about the specific exhaustion of research postings, where the science is patient and the environment is not. About Sanjay's nervous laugh, which he himself was aware of and had tried unsuccessfully to suppress. About Breckenridge's 3 photographs of his grandchildren, and the specifics in his voice when he talked about the oldest one, who was apparently learning to play the instrument that Breckenridge himself had learned as a boy and never quite mastered. About Tamboli and the tally of marks above her chair, and that she'd come in with 3 degrees of angle deviation on the Polis approach and corrected it in the last 4 seconds before contact, smooth as anything. Kwon told me about her first solo landing of a Skeld class on the training grounds outside Mira Base. The approach angle, the correction, the examiner who'd made a note without comment, the 6 months she'd spent, wondering what the note said before her certification came through. She told me about her mother, who had been a cargo pilot on the short-haul runs before the Mira expansion and had thought her daughter was making a mistake going deep-haul, and who had sent her a voice message on the day her certification posted that Kwon said she had saved and never listened to again after the first time because she was afraid she'd wear it out. She told me about a specific afternoon on the Polis surface 2 seasons ago when a storm had come in without warning and she and Tamboli had sat in the rover for 4 hours waiting it out, and how Tamboli had produced a deck of cards from somewhere in her kit that Kwon had never known she carried, and they had played a game she still didn't fully understand the rules of for the entire 4 hours. Told her about my first EVA on Polis. The surface in the early morning, before the sun cleared the horizon, when the geothermal vents were giving off steam in the cold, and the light was a dim red glow from the east, and the sky above was that deep purple-black that has no adequate Earth referent. The silence of it. The specific sensation of standing on something very old that did not know you were there, had not known anything was there for longer than the category of things had existed, and the strange smallness of that. Not frightening exactly, but clarifying. I told her about the secondary cooling loop, the pressure variance I'd been tracking for 2 years, the way it had a specific sound, when it was running at the upper edge of tolerance, that was different from the sound at normal operating temperature, by a margin most people couldn't hear. But I'd been listening to for long enough that it had become a known voice, and the specific morning when I'd been half asleep in the reactor room at 0500 AD, and heard it change, and been fully awake before I could identify why. The way you wake up, when something in a room you're sleeping in goes wrong, before your conscious mind has processed the data. I told her about my brother, about the wedding, about Tamboli at the wedding, about the specific way that Tamboli had danced, which was badly, and had known she was dancing badly, and had not cared, and how that had been one of the things I'd liked best about Tamboli. 2 hours, the med bay, the dim lights and the reactor humming through the floor. There is no way to put into a report what I heard during those 2 hours. There is no form that has a box for it. What I can tell you is that I was as certain as a person can be, in circumstances that had stripped every technical certainty away, that I was talking to Quan. Not to a thing that had learned Quan's stories and practiced Quan's cadences in the dark of the maintenance vents. Quan. To the specific weight and rhythm and texture of a person I had known for 11 years in a small world. And she had come to the same conclusion about me. We were 2 people in a room on a ship that was 5 days from home, and we had killed Fennec. I don't want to dwell on that. Dwelt on it for 8 months, and I have not found a way to make it lighter, and I don't expect to. He had been security officer on the Ardent for 7 years before my time there, and 3 years with me. He had been the kind of quiet professional that institutional structures run on. Not brilliant, not charismatic, but deeply reliable. A man who showed up and did the thing every time and expected others to do the same, and was genuinely puzzled when they didn't. He had walked to the airlock because the vote was 4-2, and because he was, in the end, more committed to the system than to his own survival, or because he'd made the calculation that fighting the vote would cost more than his life, would cost the system itself, and the system was the one thing between the rest of us and the thing in the vents. I think he knew. I think he understood, in those last seconds, that we had made a wrong call, and that he was going to walk through anyway. And I think that was Fennec, that specific and terrible version of integrity. We had 5 days and the thing was still aboard. We fainted in her quarters alive, with the hatch locked, and a cutting torch in her hands from the emergency kit. She was sitting on the bunk in the dark. She had heard the medbay alert and made a decision that going toward it was what the thing wanted. So she'd gone to ground and waited to see what came to her. Came to her was us. She looked at Quan for a long time. Looked at me for a long time. The torch didn't move. I understood the torch. It's Reyes, or one of us. And if it's Reyes, she's had 2 hours alone and she's had time to prepare for this conversation. Quan said same logic applies the other direction. Reyes said, we can run that loop indefinitely. I said yes. Thing is counting on that. It's down to 3 now. 2 on 1 are bad odds for it, so it waits. It's patient. It will wait as long as we let it wait. 5 days to Mira, and on day 3 it starts getting uncomfortable, and on day 4 it does something. And on day 5 we dock with 2 people instead of 3. Reyes was quiet, I said. Or we call the meeting, she said. On what grounds? I said, on the grounds that you locked the hatch and went to ground instead of going to the med bay. Shh. On the grounds that your first instinct was defensive rather than opportunistic, which is a human instinct and not the thing's. On the grounds that you have a cutting torch you haven't used, which means you're waiting for a reason to use it, not looking for one. And on the grounds that you are asking me for grounds, which is what Commander Reyes does. She looked at the torch in her hands. I said, we vote. If we're wrong about each other, we die, and the thing docks at Mira headquarters. And whatever comes after that, I can't stop it. If we're right, it ends here. Quan said, I vote Reyes is clean. I said, I vote Reyes is clean. Reyes set the torch down on the bunk beside her. She looked at each of us once more. Then she said, I vote Vasquez and Quan are clean. 3-0, unanimous. The 3 of us, in a locked bunk room, on a ship that had held 11, voting ourselves safe and the thing somewhere in the walls. Then Reyes stood up and said, we have to flush it out now, while we have 3 and before it decides to move. What happened next was not heroic. I want the record to reflect that clearly. There is language in the Council's preliminary report about decisive action and resourcefulness under pressure. And while I understand why institutions frame things that way, the actual experience was desperation and engineering, and the bloody-minded refusal to let the last thing we'd thought of fail, without trying it. The thing used the vents. We had known this from the beginning. The access logs, the pattern of the kills, the sounds Hargreaves had heard in the ductwork at 0300 the night she'd found Okafor's imitation sleepwalking in the corridor. 42 years of maintenance logs on the Ardent's ventilation work. 47 vent access points distributed across the ship, connecting every compartment at the primary and secondary levels. We had not been able to seal them while the kills were happening, because you cannot run a closed environment ship without active ventilation. We could seal them now. Not permanently. The ship's atmosphere would degrade in approximately 6 hours without the network operating. But for long enough. I sealed all 47 access points using the emergency lockout code, bypassing the life safety interlock with an authorization sequence I'd been issued at mission start and never expected to use. Then I ran the reactor to 110% of rated capacity. You're going to want to note that for the technical record. 110% of the reactor's design ceiling on a 42-year-old Skeld-class engine, with a secondary cooling loop that had been running at the upper edge of tolerance for 2 years. Every alarm on my board fired within 4 minutes. I acknowledged them and held the output. A Skeld-class vessel running that hot produces a thermal differential inside the sealed ventilation network that climbs to approximately 50 degrees above the ship's normal operating temperature within 90 minutes and continues climbing. The environmental systems can handle the crew compartments. They're rated for it. There's a full emergency protocol. But the vent network, sealed, becomes an oven. We didn't know if heat would kill it. We didn't know the thing's thermal tolerances. We were making the educated guess of people with no better options, which is not the same as a plan, and I want to be clear about that distinction. Reyes, Quan, and I suited up in emergency environment suits and sat in the reactor room, because the ambient temperature in the crew compartments was no longer survivable without protection. We did not speak much. There was very little left to say. The reactor hummed at 110, a different sound than its normal register. Higher, slightly harder, the sound of a system pushed past its comfort, and the alarms continued their slow cycling. And we sat in the suits and we waited. 2 hours and 11 minutes, something moved in the vent network above the reactor room. Heavy, fast, not constrained by the geometry of human movement. The sounds it made against the ductwork, the thudding and the tearing sound and the other sound. The one I've described once to the security board, and won't describe again, were not sounds that came from anything I'd ever had a name for. I can tell you it sounded large. I can tell you it sounded desperate. I can tell you, it went on for approximately 12 minutes, moving back and forth in the sealed network, and then it stopped. We held for another hour and 50 minutes. I was not opening those vents until the 4-hour mark, because whatever was in there, if it was capable of surviving partial temperatures, was capable of waiting out a short hold. 4 hours we brought the reactor back to standard output. The alarms stopped. We opened the vents. We spent 2 days going through every compartment and access point on the ship, all 3 of us together, never more than arm's reach apart, accounting for every space that something could use to hide. We found what the 4 hours had left in the ductwork between the cafeteria and the med bay. I sealed that section of duct and logged it for Mira's biological containment team, and I will not describe what was in it, and I have been informed by Mira's science division that they consider the remains highly valuable, and I have informed Mira's science division that I consider that to be a problem for them to manage without my further input. We flew the remaining 5 days in near silence. The Ardent ran cold and clean and empty around us. 10 empty chairs in the cafeteria, 10 empty bunks. The galley cleaned out by some instinct I don't fully understand. Breckenridge's photographs of his grandchildren still taped above the stove, the tally marks above Tamboli's chair running to 43. Quan flew us in on a clear morning. Mira headquarters visible through the overcast, the city beyond it. The polluted brown haze of the planet's lower atmosphere, that the long-range view from Polis had confirmed, was real and not a trick of the telescope. She brought us in at textbook approach, perfect angle, no deviation. I didn't say anything about it. She didn't either. Some things are complete without comment. The containment team met us on the landing pad. The medical team after them. Eventually, the security board, and then the council, and then you. Let me tell you what I've told each of them, and what is the only conclusion I've reached in 8 months of looking at this from every angle available to me. That thing was better than us. at almost everything that matters in a closed environment over a long duration. It was more patient than we were. Its mimicry was effectively perfect at every level of analysis we could apply. It had no grief to manage, no loyalty to navigate, no moment of hesitation when hesitation would have cost it. It had studied us long enough before it moved that it knew our patterns, our habits, our decision heuristics. It understood at some level that we operated by consensus, and it had positioned itself to influence that consensus from inside. It was a superior predator. In every technical sense in that closed system, it had the advantages. What it didn't have, and what I've come to believe it genuinely could not have, not as a limitation of this specimen but as a structural feature of what it was the ability to call a meeting. I mean that precisely. A meeting, in the sense I'm describing, is not a gathering or a consultation. It is the specific act of forcing a decision in conditions where the information is incomplete. The consequences of being wrong are catastrophic, and the easier choice is to wait. It requires every participant to accept that they might be the one who is wrong, that their certainty might be a liability, that the person sitting across from them, who they have known for years and trust entirely, might be the thing, and that they have to vote anyway. It requires the person who is being voted against to walk to the airlock because the system demands it, and because the system's survival is worth more than their individual outcome. That is not a comfortable mechanism. It is a brutal one. The three of us who are alive because we kept running it, even when we ran it wrong. And Fennec is dead because he understood what it required better than any of us. I don't know if there are more of them on Polis. I don't know if what we sealed in the deep chambers was one specimen or 100. I don't know what the thing was thinking. In whatever sense thinking applies to it, when it boarded a 42-year-old ship and found 11 ordinary people going about their work. I don't know if it was capable of surprise. At the end, when the oven closed around it and the patience ran out, I know it came out of the dark expecting to win. I know it lost. I know why. That's all I have for you.